Hello, my name is Grzegorz Śpiewak and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about how to work with a so-called multi-year course book with grade 1, 2 and 3 of lower primary education. Now, if you look at my title, you will see a rather important word in the title, and that, of course, is the word hands. Why hands? Well, the question can be answered very simply if you look at the results of current brain research into how brains perceive and learn about the world. Now, when you think about this for a moment, you discover very quickly that it is the hands that are massively overrepresented in the brain as instruments of perception and instruments of learning. I say overrepresented because traditionally their role was, if you like, downplayed compared to the other main two senses, and that is, of course, the sense of sight and the sense of hearing. And yet, it turns out that it is the hands, particularly in the hands of the young, that are the prime instruments of finding out and learning about the world. Now, this, of course, in a sense, is not new news in education, good education anyway. If you look at the writings of Maria Montessori, to take one very prominent classic example, she insisted that the hands were indeed the instruments of, as she put this, man's intelligence. And further, that the hand allowed the listener, the reader, the learner, indeed, to reveal itself as a learning organism. And last but not least, with a learner who is still not a writing and reading one, it is the hand again and the manual stroke tactile activity that is the prime educational activity with this kind of person. If you think now in terms of how this kind of polysensory, tactile, kinesthetic, bodily learning is different from the classic pen and paper transmission model of learning, well, of course, the key difference is the difference in just how many channels we as educators have learned to involve when it comes to education, including critically, of course, language education. And this brings me rather smoothly, I hope, into how books as prime instruments of learning have changed over the past few decades, taking into account those findings in brain research and education in general. And as I said, books have indeed gone a long way from looking like they used to when I was a student to the way they used to look like very, very recently. And when I say very recently, I mean not just the fact that they have grown bigger, full color, glossy, and generally more attractive looking, but the fact that the approach to language pedagogy was one which focused not just on the sense of sight and the sense of hearing, but gave the learner a number of very varied opportunities to involve other senses, including critically the sense of touch and generally movement as an instrument of learning. Jane Moon, world authority on anything to do with language acquisition with young learners in particular, puts this very succinctly. She says, quite simply, children learn language directly through first-hand experiences. And I don't think that reference to hand is just a fortunate coincidence here. From all of this that we have said in the opening to this session, it must come as quite a surprise, if not plain shock, when you start reading individual regulations of the new educational law for Poland. And one thing which transpires more than anything else is that when it comes to books for non-reading and non-writing children, a number of things that we as language teachers have grown to accept as the standard repertoire of everything that we do with those kids behind classroom doors suddenly must go from the student book. What sort of things in particular? Well, you know, I could list a whole range of different things, but just to take a few representative examples, all sorts of stickers cannot be used simply because using a sticker will use up the book the first time it is used by the learner. So no stickers, no coloring, no tracing elements, no numbering of elements with the help of pen, pencil or crayon, no connecting things up, no drawing sets amongst different elements on a printed page, and so on and so forth. Now, if you are thinking, well, how am I supposed to even work with non-writing and non-reading kids given those rather contrived conditions? Well, of course, I would not be wasting my breath were it not for the fact that there is indeed a solution that I would like to present to you very soon indeed. One thing that I want to amplify, however, before I go any further, is that this solution should critically involve a certain amount of good pedagogical reflection into which activity types indeed, rather than some others perhaps that we could potentially use, have the appropriate balance of the multi-sensory learning as such and the linguistic gains in the foreign language on the other hand. Because of course it is the balance that makes this activity particularly worthwhile in the context of language education rather than just early education that we might offer as part of grade 1 teaching. So on to the solution then. The solution that I would like to present to you is threefold, if you like. The first is I will try and sell, inverted commas, to you a certain number of what I call virtual manual activities. Why virtual? Because of course we cannot, strictly speaking, interact with the paper in the student's book, but this shouldn't stop us from using creativity, imagination, and a certain type of hand movement to support language learning. The second part of the solution is looking in a principled way for activity types which we must compensate for. Those that are critical for certain types of linguistic skills and which as such, once they got purged from the student books, must be sought after somewhere else. And the third part of the solution is, if you like, a certain amount of good thinking on your part as language teachers about which craft activities are particularly worth doing, or if they are not readily available, which of them are worth searching for, again, in order to provide this happy balance between the manual and the linguistic. That's what I'm going to turn to now, beginning with the virtual manual type of practice. What does this mean behind classroom doors? Well, in fact, it means something very simple. If we are unable to use a number of hand muscles in order to perform certain types of movements with the help of pencil or pen or crayon, it should not stop us from exercising the relevant muscles and using a range of very simple, easy to interpret gestures as part of a long list of activity types that we can still use from the student's book as part of our everyday teaching of language behind classroom doors. What sorts of gestures could those be? Well, to give you the simplest example possible, imagine an activity where either the teacher reads out a certain number of words, or maybe the teacher simply plays the recording where the kids need to look at certain objects on a printed page and decide whether what they hear represents the appropriate number. So, if you hear number 3, is this a banana? If it is not, then, apart from saying that it is not, you can also signal this to other learners and to the teacher by making an appropriate gesture. And of course, in contrast, you can show a yes gesture where you agree that the information you hear is the one that you see on the printed page. It's easy to manage, it takes very little time, and it gives a chance for the teacher to get instant feedback from all of the learners around the room. To give you a different sort of example, I'm sure all of you have grown rather used to involving the kids in all sorts of coloring activities. Well, I have to tell you, as a language teacher, methodologist, but also as a parent, that I am not perhaps the greatest fan of those activities. One reason for this is that they are inevitably messy. They will amplify natural mixed ability that is part of any language classroom that I'm sure you have to deal with. And now, if you have a good learner, one that can actually color skillfully, they will be able to do this without your help, and I don't think they will learn anything of value as part of this activity rather than simply confirming that they can. They are also going to do it rather quickly and be ready to be, if you like, entertained with another activity, while another learner will probably simply struggle with a random color crayon and make a big mess out of, in this case, a silhouette of a gingerbread boy, without, again, learning much in terms of the actual skill of coloring, because there's no time for it, and you will be rushing on to your next activity anyway. And as far as the linguistic gain is concerned, I will argue there isn't that much that you can actually do once the gingerbread silhouette has indeed been colored in one way or another. And this is where virtual manual practice, I think, comes in. When you look at the way that this particular activity has changed in a multi-year course book, I think we have room for saying it is rather a creative and positive change, because instead of spending precious minutes attempting, perhaps in vain, to color that gingerbread boy silhouette, a child is now recommended to pinch imaginary sand using a pinching gesture, and once he or she has selected the right color, they can lift that color, of course, again, imaginary, it's virtual practice, and put it on the appropriate body part of the silhouette. Notice that this is also the kind of change which will make it very easy to help the kids pronounce the relevant words as they are doing those imaginary gestures, which is a very much desirable side effect of those changes, and in particular the virtual manual practice. To give you perhaps yet another example of this, activities where a child would listen and then tick items that they can hear in a recording or when the teacher reads out a piece of text. Well, of course, ticking is not allowed because this would use up the book. But does this mean we cannot use this material in a way? Well, of course we can. This is where the virtual manual practice comes handy. How does one do it? Well, you can, for instance, use crayons or a pencil and ask the child to perform a spinning movement. You spin the crayon, and once you do, it will point at one of the objects, and then you will be able to pronounce it, of course. Because it's not so much the pointing and the spinning, but using the pointing and the spinning to produce a little bit of suspense in order to have an excuse for saying a word in English. After all, it's part of an English lesson rather than some other subject at school, perhaps. To give you perhaps yet another example where I think, again, the change has actually produced an activity which is arguably even better than it used to be, take a look at this one, where traditionally, again, it would be a listening activity where the child would report comprehension by numbering the relevant pictures in order. Now, that's all very well, but in this particular case, wouldn't it be more fun to actually produce something with those words rather than simply number them, tick them, or do something else rather abstract and dry? And here is the modified virtual manual version of this activity. Instead of doing what I showed you before, now you can walk through the linguistic maze, and each time you land on an object, you have an excuse, again, to say its name in English, because it's part of an English lesson rather than some other lesson, as I said before. In other words, virtual manual practice leads to a number of very real pedagogical and linguistic benefits. And this is what I would like us to take away from the first part of my solution to the manual activity problem. In other words, while the actual practice to a certain extent is virtual, the benefits are very much real. What kind of benefits? Well, first of all, if you do the gestures on a systematic basis, you will in fact continue to practice and exercise the very same set of manual muscles which the child needs to practice in order to train the little hand to start producing English letters in a few months' time. You will also create, through the hand, extra memory traces. In other words, this polysensory experience that I amplified so much at the beginning of the program can now still be achieved by doing the gestures on a virtual rather than a real tactile basis. And the important side effect, very important educationally when it comes to language teachers, is that all of those activities will, as a side effect, as I said, support the development of writing skills in subsequent months. In other words, we are a lot closer than perhaps it might seem initially to making sure that at least some of the operations are being attended to. What about those which are not? Well, they have to be compensated for. There is no question. And of those, I would like to highlight one or two which I consider particularly relevant from the perspective, again, of the linguistic benefits of those activities. The first is what I call smart coloring. What are smart coloring activities? Well, you find them traditionally in the workbook, do you not? That's where they always have been, and fortunately, that's where they are going to remain. Those activities invite the child not just to do a bit of normal coloring, we talked about this before, but rather to make sure that they first decide which of the two linguistic items they want to find on the printed page, and then, very importantly, to, if you like, carve it out through that maze of curvy lines, dots, and other abstract-looking shapes. And in case you are thinking, well, you know, is this really very different from just trying to perhaps in vain color a silhouette of a gingerbread boy? Well, the answer is yes, it is very different, because this is the kind of cognitive training which is very much alike the type of training which dyslexic students need in order to learn, for instance, that in order to distinguish between a B letter and a D letter, you in essence need to train your brain to notice a certain type of abstract arrangement of lines and curvy shapes. And it just so happens to be an accident that with the B it is like this, and with the D it's on the other side of the circle. And if you're thinking, you know, how does this connect up with the sort of smart coloring idea? Well, let me show you a much enlarged shape, which is, you know, to any legible reader, instantaneously recognizable word sign for bed. But if you look at this through 6-year-old eyes, you will notice, no doubt, that in fact this is very much the image of the bed as if you were looking at it from up front, where the two sides are represented, including, you know, the bed posts on the left and on the right, as well as the E in the middle, which is almost like the mattress sign. It's all, you see, a way of how you learn to associate certain abstract combinations of lines and shapes with the semantic value. Hence the smart coloring and its massive pedagogical value as part of a learning English language learning program. Another type of activity which no doubt would be a great shame if we were to lose it is a systematic program of training children to first of all recognize linguistic objects and then learn to represent them on their own, first through tracing and eventually through writing letters on their own. Again, why is it so important to have this on a systematic basis? Because this is the only way to correlate it to the main selection of items, which is part of your lesson plan as represented in the student's book. And this, I think, leads to one very obvious conclusion, and that is that if you want to make sure that you attend to those critical activities on a systematic basis, rather than having to look for them, for instance, on the internet and then having to worry about whether a particular lexical set is actually identical to the one that you have in your core vocabulary list in your student's book, the only way to achieve this in realistic terms is to make sure that your students have access to the workbook on a systematic basis. And notice the workbook in this new situation becomes a critical compensating tool, not just for homework, but also in the classroom. And that, I think, is part two of that solution that I already advertised a bit earlier. The last thing that I would like to draw your attention to is principled selection of manual activities. Why is this important? Because you see, it's not only a question of how I use a manual activity to fill a certain number of minutes of precious classroom time, but once I produce a craft activity, how much linguistic benefit will I get out of it with my learners? To give you one positive example of such an activity, craft activity, I will show you something that I produced myself using my non-existent manual skills, so apologies in advance for the way it's going to look. Let me retrieve it. It is a basket, a shopping basket, part of a crafts activity portfolio which you can still find in a good workbook for your main student's book. And this kind of basket is, to me, a sort of typical example of a good balance between the manual and the linguistic. Why? Well, on the one hand, of course, it will take time to lift this sort of three-dimensional shape out of a two-dimensional worksheet, will it not? And it will take time to fold it in appropriate places, make sure that it assumes more or less appropriate shape. Not such an easy task, not just for 6 or 7-year-old, believe you me. And once it is produced and doesn't get lost or forgotten at home, notice it becomes a fantastically recyclable type of tool. And that's what I like about it. You can use it when it comes to the shopping vocabulary, no doubt, right? You practice your going to the supermarket type of idea, and you have a range of mini flashcards, which again needs to be cut out from another worksheet, which the kids will be able to put into the basket and out of it with the accompanying language, of course. But it's not just that. Imagine a different unit, a unit where you practice school objects. Well, it shouldn't stop you from imagining that you're doing a different kind of shopping, and this time you have a few of those, right, which again can be used to recycle the basket as such and use it as an excuse to play yet another shopping game, in other words, to recycle another vocabulary set. Now, I will get rid of the baskets with your permission and turn to another tool, which I hope you will see in a moment is also incredibly purposeful from the perspective of this balance between the manual and the linguistic. It is, and he made a dramatic pause, a tiger paw. A tiger paw is something that editors and authors of the Tiger series came up with as an instrument that replaces what stickers used to do. And what stickers used to do is, of course, a recycling activity based on a set of familiar vocabulary items in a particular unit of the student's book. Now, how does the student end up with their own very special tiger paw? This, of course, is not the right size. It's too big to be used with an A4 student's book. It is, for you guys, a symbol which you can use in order to announce a tiger paw activity with your students. Now, you have a silhouette, an outline of a tiger paw in your new teacher's book for Tiger 1, so you can photocopy it and give out to every student, and they can cut it out, color it, and, very important, have the name signed at the back of it, with your help, no doubt, so that the relevant tiger paw always lands in the appropriate hands of the appropriate student. Now, what's the whole story of the tiger paw, and why am I so excited about it? Well, first of all, you make the tiger paws with your students as part of core activities in Unit 1 student books. It is there in order to replace the stickers. And this is, if you like, a virtual sticker now, where the virtual manual practice with this kind of crafts in the students' hands will involve something that we used to do by asking students to simply label individual objects with appropriate picture stickers or maybe word stickers, which is very well. It takes quite a bit of time, but given that we cannot do it anymore in the student books, we can now use the tiger paw to perform an activity which arguably is even more fun and definitely more of a excuse, again, to use language productively. So imagine student A is in the possession of their own tiger paw and starts covering random pictures in this particular vocabulary page in the student's book. And of course, the other student needs to guess which word has just got hidden. Now, if you think this is easy, let me play a little with you guys now in front of the screen. As you see, I am covering random words on the page. And isn't it true that even with fluent speakers, users of English like you guys, it is not immediately obvious which word gets hidden? This is the fun. This is the excuse for the brain to get involved. And this is how this craft is really worth making with your students. Now notice that I would not be amplifying this as much if it were not for the fact that such activities are intrinsically recyclable. You go to Unit 2 and you will have another set of items which you can again use with the help of the tiger paw as an excuse for kids to play the game and keep on pronouncing the relevant vocabulary items. This is what we do for all of the units in Tiger 1 student's book. In Tiger 2 student's book, we have an alternative tool. Again, a bit of a craft project activity. This time it's a tiger head. And again, the outlines are in the teacher's book. You can photocopy the outlines, give them to the students. They can cut them out, do the coloring, and then put the tiger face at the top of a pencil or a crayon to be recycled with every single unit where the relevant activity comes. And this represents a certain principle that I would like to conclude this session with. The principle is something I've taken from Jane Moon, the fantastic classic book on how children learn English in a modern way. And when she talks about selecting craft activities, she insists that before we endeavor that sort of project, we think through parameters such as how appropriate is this particular craft activity for my purposes? Or is it only a time filler? Perhaps, with all due respect. Is the making time actually justified and if I may add, balanced out with the linguistic opportunity that arises in course of using this particular craft? How easy is this craft to store? Very important that a paw or the basket that I showed you before is actually very easy to put inside a portfolio or inside a teacher's drawer and be retrieved whatever chance arises. And last but not least, from the perspective of Jane Moon at least, is the level of cognitive engagement appropriate given the particular craft that has been produced. Well, I hope that with this you are sufficiently ready to take on the new student books. And just to wrap it up, 3 things that need to be attended to. The first is, let's make sure that whatever we do contains an element, at least, of what I earlier called virtual manual practice. If there is an activity type which we know is valuable and cannot be done in a virtual manual manner, let's make sure we compensate for it with the help of a selection of activities from the workbook. And last but not least, when we embark on producing a craft activity, then let's make sure that the linguistic benefits are appropriate given the time it takes to do such an activity. I'm sure you can manage. I have great faith in you guys, and from now on it's all in your hands, no doubt. So I keep my fingers crossed, and I'm sure it will be absolutely fantastic. Good luck with your teaching in grade 1 and beyond.